Southeast Asia has seen one of the world's biggest growth in financial technology or fintech with the digital payments such as GoPay, GrabPay, OVO, and QR systems such as QRIS. Do you see U.S. players such as Visa, MasterCard, and PayPal being able to compete in those areas in the near future?
Well, they've all been in the market for quite a number of years, so I think they are well placed to compete. But, I think to your point, there is a very vibrant ecosystem in fintech in at least some Southeast Asian countries. And you do see wide adoption of it. And in a lot of ways, it strikes me that they're kind of leapfrogging the United States and maybe other countries in the West.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Asia Forward podcast, where we discuss forward-thinking ideas in U.S. and Southeast Asia business. My name is Ei Thant Sin, and I'll be your host today. Today, we are going to take a closer look at the expanding digital economy in Southeast Asia and what it means to American businesses. To discuss the topic today, we have John Goyer, Vice President for Southeast Asia and Oceania at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce here in Washington, D.C. Hi, John. Thanks for joining our conversation today.
Thanks for having me.
First and foremost, if you could briefly share with our viewers the role of U.S. Chamber of Commerce and explain to us the difference between the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and American chambers of commerce that exist in different individual countries across the world. And what is your role and what's the role that you play and the services that you offer for your member companies?
Sure. Well, thank you for that. So the U.S. Chamber of Commerce has been around now for about 112 years, 113 years, and it's the largest business federation in the United States, in the world, really. And we exist to represent the interests of the American business community in the policy-making process, in the legislative, the taxation, all areas of public policy. My own role is, as you said at the outset, I cover Southeast Asia and Oceania. The Chamber is primarily a policy advocacy organization, so we're working with our member companies to identify issues of market access or investment restrictions or regulatory challenges in those markets that pose problems for our members in trying to do business in those markets. So we work with those governments, with our own government, with AmChams, as you mentioned, and other groups to try to advance reforms where we feel those would be appropriate to making the business climate in these countries more welcoming and more competitive, ultimately. To your question about the AmChams, so these are groupings that represent American business on the ground in overseas markets. And there's, I think there's about 125 or so of them around the world. We have them in all the large markets in Southeast Asia. And so we often have overlapping memberships, although the individuals within the membership are different, but a lot of the same companies and therefore a lot of the same broad policy objectives, which allows us to work in partnership with the AmChams when it's advantageous and makes sense to do so. We share information, exchange newsletters. We try to be sort of eyes and ears on the ground here for them, and they do the same for us, watching events out in the region.
U.S. Chamber of Commerce has over 3 million companies that you work with. And how has the U.S. Chamber of Commerce helped the member companies navigate the twists and turns of U.S. tariff policy, especially those operating or investing in Southeast Asia?
Yeah. Well, we are very closely engaged with the administration, with the Congress, and we spend a lot of time following what is happening with tariff policy and understanding what it means. So we're working directly with our members to hear from them how their business is being impacted by tariffs. We talk to lawyers and other legal professionals and specialists when we look at the content of some of these executive orders and decrees that are laying out different tariff policies. And ultimately, we are trying to get transparency on where tariff policy is right now and how it might change based on either court rulings or other developments. So it does keep us quite busy. And I would hasten to add that that's the international side of the U.S. Chamber. It's a large organization. The international division of it is large, but there's a much larger part of the organization that focuses on a lot of domestic issues. In very recent years, there's been a lot of focus on tax reform, for example, which we've seen as generally positive. We focus on issues around permitting, for example, trying to help the United States become more energy independent. A lot of the barriers to that we found are homegrown and permitting and, taking years to get project approvals for, pipelines or grid or new power capacity, et cetera, it hobbles us. So we spend a lot of time working on those issues. But we also have a team that looks at supply chains, and that's been another very busy team lately. We have a team that specializes in IP, in issues around healthcare, certainly digital economy, and lots of other areas. So we cover a lot of issues that impact the business community in one way or the other.
Southeast Asia digital economy is projected to grow over 300 billion. When we say digital economy in Southeast Asia, what is the first thing that comes to mind for you? And where are the growth opportunities?
Yeah, I think it was actually forecast to hit the 300 billion mark last year. Google, Temasek, and Bain do an annual assessment on Southeast Asia's digital economy each year, and they did, by their reckoning, Southeast Asia crossed that 300 billion threshold last year. And I think that encompasses an array of digital services. You've got conventional e-commerce, of course, but they also talk about delivery apps, Uber Eats and the like. You've got streamed entertainment. And so there's a lot of elements to what we call the digital economy. And that report in particular, I think, does a really good job in breaking those down.
Let's start with Indonesia, since it's fresh on our mind. Recently, President Prabowo visited Washington, D.C., and Indonesia joined Malaysia and Cambodia in signing agreement on reciprocal trade, ART, with the United States. Mm-hmm. And the Chamber was one of the organizations that hosted President Prabowo for the high-level engagement with the American business community. So can you give us an overview of what those engagements are and what ART means for U.S. and Indonesia trade and the way forward?
He talked a lot about his plans for the Indonesian economy. I think he's very focused on trying to bring that economy to kind of the next level with greater value added, increasing the level of technology and the production in Indonesia. Obviously, nickel, copper, other critical minerals are front and center in all conversations these days, and that certainly includes Indonesia. So a lot of talk around those issues. Indonesia is facing some challenges right now in the financial sector. We've seen the downgradings from Moody's, Fitch, and then prior to that, MCSI. And I think he recognizes that, there is work that needs to be done to shore up the financial sector. And I think that he's very focused on it. I think his government is focused on it, but the challenges are big.
From those agreements, what concrete changes that U.S. businesses can expect on the ground in the country?
Yeah. And, I've read the agreements. We haven't had a kind of formal debrief with USTR or other U.S. officials on it. So I think we do have some questions about some aspects of those agreements. But in general, I think with the Indonesia agreement in particular, there are elements that I think are very favorable. So, for example, all three of those agreements talk about maintaining support for a permanent moratorium on putting tariffs on electronic transmissions. This has been going on in the WTO for 2 decades. And I think memorializing that commitment in an agreement is very positive from the perspective of the business community. But other aspects of the digital economy too, like data flows, for example, cooperation and cybersecurity in those areas, I think are potentially some real positives. And we saw these in some of the earlier ARTs as well. So I think that those are important achievements. The question is implementation, as always. And I think the time frame for that is uncertain right now because where we did have what we call reciprocal tariffs, 19% for Indonesia, and the same with Malaysia and Cambodia, the legal basis for those tariffs was invalidated by the court. And so that's been replaced with a separate clause in U.S. trade law that allows more limited tariffs for a more limited period of time. And so we think we know at this point what the tariffs are generally. There are exceptions. But how long will that last and what will happen after the time period during which the current tariffs will last elapses? What happens after that? And, we don't know.
You mentioned data flow, so let's talk about that. Indonesia has historically leaned towards data localization in certain sectors. Does this new agreement signal a shift towards more open data flows? And how significant is that for U.S. businesses?
The ability to move data across borders is vital. And it is vital not just for quote unquote tech companies. It's really any company that is doing business internationally is moving data across borders. So whether you're in the auto industry or in the mining industry or in tech or manufacturing, you're moving data across borders and you need the ability to do that. The ART does signal a greater latitude for companies to move data across borders, provided that appropriate conditions are met. So it strikes us that this is a positive move forward. This has been an issue in the past in Indonesia, but in other markets as well.
From the point of view of U.S. investors, the U.S. agreements with Malaysia, Cambodia, and Indonesia as a signal for lower barriers for entry in the digital sector in Southeast Asia? Or are there other risks that we need to factor in? And what are some of the non-tariff barriers that U.S. business face day to day while working across Southeast Asia market?
Yeah. Well, there are a number of them. These vary somewhat by market, but, certainly issues that we've looked at in, say, Indonesia around local content requirements, being required to produce a good or some portion of a good in Indonesia in order to be able to sell it in the Indonesian market. We've had real challenges around import licensing, and the difficulty and a lack of transparency in the process of getting those licenses and permits. So to the extent that the ART can address that, I think that's going to be a very positive move. There are commitments around IP. I think that's always to the good, more robust protection and enforcement of intellectual property rights and the like.
Thank you, John. Before we continue our conversation, I'd like to remind our viewers that if you enjoy our conversation, don't forget to click subscribe on our channel. Now, let's talk about digital payments. Southeast Asia has seen one of the world's biggest growth in financial technology or fintech. with the digital payments such as GoPay, GrabPay, OVO, and QR systems such as QRIS. Do you see U.S. players such as Visa, MasterCard, and PayPal being able to compete in those areas in the near future?
Well, they've all been in the market for quite a number of years, so I think they are well placed to compete. But I think to your point, there is a very vibrant ecosystem in fintech in at least some Southeast Asian countries, and you do see wide adoption of it. And in a lot of ways, it strikes me that they're kind of leapfrogging the United States and maybe other countries in the West where, people like myself, I think of fintech as using my credit card, and they are going leaps and bounds beyond that. And especially younger populations, more tech savvy people, it all sort of fits in together. Anything that eases the friction in transactions, lowers transaction costs. Yeah. I think that is to be welcomed, and I think that there is a broader payoff in terms of higher economic growth.
As we know, ASEAN has DEFA, Digital Economy Framework Agreement, which is expected to be finalized sometimes this year. How likely is it for Southeast Asia to move forward with a more consistent digital regulations all across the region? And how are U.S. businesses positioned for this development? Is there any optimism for this development?
I can't handicap the likelihood of DEFA going forward, but Southeast Asian countries are making digital economy deals with others within Asia and outside of Asia. Singapore, for example, just finalized talks on a Singapore-EU digital agreement, and you're seeing a lot of that sort of thing. And so I expect that in some cases, those agreements would probably go beyond what is in the internal ASEAN agreements, which is fine to the extent that that maybe puts upward pressure on the standards in the ASEAN agreement.
Beyond e-commerce, how prepared is Southeast Asia when it comes to digital economy and digital infrastructures like data centers and cloud capacity, especially with the AI?
Well, those Google reports talk every year about how many tens of millions of people in Southeast Asia have just come online in that past year. And so you see this year after year. So, a large pool of internet users already, and one which has been growing rapidly. And I think that does make them well placed to adopt some of those technologies. I think in terms of some of the investment, this gets back to some of the deficiencies that we talked about previously, grid and capacity and so forth. They are obviously building lots of data center capacity across Southeast Asia, in Indonesia, in Malaysia, Vietnam, Thailand, and elsewhere. And that makes sense because they need it. I think that there is a sense that having those facilities in their markets will help kind of jumpstart a broader high-tech economy. I don't know if that's exactly true, but regardless, you do need to have that kind of cloud capacity. Now, one of the challenges there, I think front and center, is the question of energy. And so data centers are energy intensive, and especially those that are using AI-powered chips. And so the challenge for Indonesia, Malaysia, and others is to scale up the power capacity as quickly as they're trying to scale up the data centers themselves. And that adds extra problems when these countries are also trying to meet carbon reduction commitments and various climate goals. And the limited amount of renewables that are available now to power these data centers, I think, are one of the challenges. And so I think countries are trying to think creatively about non-fossil fuel solutions, if that's where their domestic policy is taking them. So a lot of talk around, for example, small modular nuclear reactors, as there's been talk here in the United States about having nuclear-powered data centers.
What are the main economies in Southeast Asia that you personally are paying attention to and are prioritizing in?
Well, we don't really prioritize one over the other, but we do follow the lead of our members. And so we work on the issues and on the economies that our members tell us are the priorities for them. And so, I think it's probably no surprise we spend more time working on the larger economies in Southeast Asia than the smaller ones. And that's simply a result of the demand from our members.
As the Southeast Asia digital economy grows, how is that impacting the geopolitical balance in Southeast Asia, especially with U.S. and China being in competition in technology?
Well, I think that it has the potential to put some of these countries in a difficult spot. If you want to use Huawei, for example, for certain of your communications systems or infrastructure, that might not be well received in Washington, which will be looking at other solutions. The State Department just announced a new program within the past 2 weeks to fund entrepreneurs to develop new systems for what they call trusted smartphones, trusted cell phones, those that are running on, say, Android or, operating systems that are used more commonly here rather than elsewhere, and developing products to standards such that they're safer to use for the consumer and for the businesses that are using them, that sort of thing. So I think that's just one small example of the kind of competition that I expect we'll see more of. There will be I think a continued tussle over standards of all sorts, whether that's in AI or in other areas. I think that's the reality that we're going to be looking at for the near term.
Where does the conversation of critical mineral come into play in all of this, if at all?
Critical minerals are embedded in so much of this. It's not just AI chips, although certainly that is part of it, but in alternative energy, high-tech communications, defense systems. There are a lot of applications for that. The fact is the U.S. is a great consumer of these things, but we are not a producer of them. Many of them we don't have in our soil in the United States, and we certainly don't have the refining and processing capacity. And so in both cases, I think China has a huge lead over kind of everybody else. They have a lot of those materials in their ground, and they certainly are leaders in processing and refining.
So, John, I'd be remiss if I don't ask you any questions about my home country, Myanmar. And U.S. Chamber has played a significant role in normalizing business relationships between the United States and Myanmar back in 2011. Obviously, time has changed, and the political and economic situation in Myanmar is complex, to say the least. How are the American businesses viewing the Myanmar market? Is it completely written off, or is there potential for growth?
Yeah, it's funny. When I first started at the Chamber, which was around the time frame that you mentioned, the first thing in my inbox was Myanmar. And my boss at the time said, okay, it's outwardly evident that internal change is taking place in that country, and we need to do something. So do something on Myanmar. So I tried to do something on Myanmar, which was to pull together a coalition of our member companies who were potentially interested in that market. And we mapped out the landscape of sanctions that were in place at the time, which were pretty extensive: trade, investment, kind of across the board, just about zero aid or assistance from any U.S. government agency. U.S. executive directors at the multilaterals would be required to vote against loans to the country, all sorts of those kinds of restrictions. So we set about trying to get policy changes in those areas. The argument being that we want to support this government that is, by all appearances, trying to open up, trying to reform itself, and we want to positively reinforce that. I think we were fortunate at the time because both the White House and the Congress were more or less on the same page, which was that they did want to reach out to the Myanmar government. At the time, the pivot to Asia was still a live thing. And I think that the transition in Myanmar was seen very much as part of that broader pivot in terms of U.S. policy. So over the course of a couple of years, we were actually pretty successful in getting trade sanctions lifted. We had an import ban at the time. That was lifted, the restrictions on investment. We tried to rationalize and streamline what we call the specially designated national list. And this is a list of individuals that the Treasury Department maintains who are kind of off limits as far as U.S. companies doing business with them for a variety of reasons. So we were able to get some modest changes there. And there was a lot of excitement for a period of time. And it seemed like business delegations were going to Myanmar, every week. I led several of them myself. The chamber was very active there. So there were delegations, there were meetings, there was interest, but it never really resulted in a lot of U.S. investment. There was some. But I don't think as much, certainly not as much as the Myanmar authorities had hoped. Nor, frankly, as much as I had expected or I had assumed would come in there, given the attractiveness of the place. But I think ultimately, most companies made the decision that, in spite of all this reform, in spite of the changes in U.S. policy, the risk level is up here and the expected return is somewhere lower than that. And so that makes it a straightforward commercial question of whether or not to go into the market.
How is it different for this time? And are U.S. American companies looking for a specific sector or areas that they are thinking about growth or opportunity to go in, or is it something that they don't really consider right now?
The small number of U.S. companies that are there are in different sectors. You do have tech, but you have fast-moving consumer goods. You've got auto dealership. You've got machinery, construction equipment. So it is pretty diverse. And there is a small but very active AmCham in Myanmar, actually, and they do a terrific job in spite of the challenges that they've faced. So, it's pretty hard right now. Obviously, we have been in a situation of civil war, for decades, but it's been more, I think it's come more to the fore in people's consciousness since the coup in
2021.
21.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of companies are looking at Myanmar and they just see such high risk without the offsetting potential for return that it just makes it impossible to commit long-term capital into the market, at least at this point.
Yeah. So as we have Asia forward, let's do some forward thinking. So if you look ahead 5 to 10 years from now, where do you see Southeast Asia digital economy realistically?
When Google first started doing those Southeast Asia e-economy reports, they had predicted that it would take quite a lot longer than 2025 to reach that $300 billion threshold. I think they said that they got there about 1.5 times faster than had been initially forecast some years prior. So one lesson I would take from that is that it will grow, and it may grow more rapidly than you think. And for the reasons that we've talked about, you first off have young tech savvy people, and I think that's the first absolute must have. Secondly, I think that while governments don't always get it right, they are spending a lot of time looking at different models of governance of different aspects of the internet. Vietnam is the first country in the region to pass an AI law. Malaysia is considering AI legislation later this year. I know that Indonesia is looking at a couple of different frameworks, and similar conversations are taking place in other countries. There's been lots of conversations around data flows issues, independently of the trade agreements with the U.S. A lot of conversations around data, around cybersecurity, around data privacy. And the chamber itself is very engaged with those governments and other governments around the world in those conversations. But I would be optimistic looking ahead 5 to 10 years on regarding Southeast Asia's digital economy.
Do you see an integrated rule-based digital market regulations all across the region, or is it going to be competitive but fragmented? And based on that, how should American businesses position themselves?
Yeah. So far, the policy development process has been pretty fragmented. If you take out AI as an example, all these countries are in kind of different places and they're looking at different models. So I think it could be quite some time before we were at a place where there were more unified, harmonized rules across the region. It would be good. It would make the region more competitive. It makes it more attractive to investors who want to operate in several or all of the ASEAN countries. I think it's going to take a long time to get there. They're certainly not there yet.
John, thank you so much for your insight on how American businesses should navigate and face challenges in Southeast Asia's fast-growing digital economy.
Thank you for having me.
And to our audience, thank you for tuning in. You can find the full episode on YouTube and Spotify. Don't forget to subscribe for more conversations on forward-thinking ideas on U.S. and Southeast Asia business. You can also follow us on LinkedIn, Instagram, and check out our website at asiaforward.org. We look forward to your comments as well. My name is Ei Thant Sin, and I'll see you next time.